Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. We are a New York-based nonprofit organization that's trying to create more informed conversations around global affairs. And today, I'm very, very pleased to have three wonderful panelists to talk about access to medicine and healthcare worldwide. I think it's a topic that is on everyone's minds, given the fact that we are all living in the middle of a pandemic, with many saying that the only way forward can really happen safely only with a vaccine that can be distributed on a mass scale to both rich and poor alike. And so we wanted to take a step back and look at global public health with a focus on access to medicine and treatment and pharmaceuticals. We want to understand both the existing problems around access to life-saving medicine and vaccines, and also what some of the solutions are. Or just as a reminder, nearly 10% of the world lives in extreme poverty, which is defined as less than $2 a day. And that statistic says nothing about the state of or access to healthcare. And as this pandemic has shown us, we are all very much in the same boat when it comes to solving this crisis. And so we really wanted to put the solution in the context of a larger problem of access to medicine, treatments, and vaccines worldwide. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we will kick it off. So we are very pleased to have, Dr. Thomas Pogge, who has received his PhD in philosophy from Harvard. And he is the Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs and founding director of the Global Justice Program at Yale. He is a member of the Norwegian Academy of Science, as well as co-founder of Academic Stand Against Poverty, an international network aiming to enhance the impact of scholars, teachers, and students on global poverty, and of Incentives for Global Health, a team effort toward developing a complement to the pharmaceutical patent regime that would improve access to advanced medicines for the poor worldwide. His publications include Designing an Ethics, Global Tax Fairness, Politics as Usual, World Poverty and Human Rights, Global Justice and Global Ethics, and John Rawls, His Life and Theory of Justice, and Freedom from Poverty as a Human Right. We also have Dr. Gary Gottlieb, who is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and a member of the National Academy of Medicine. From 2015 through 2019, he served as CEO of Partners in Health, a global NGO that provides a preferential option for the poor in healthcare in severely resource-constrained settings. From 2010 until February of 2015, Dr. Gottlieb was the CEO of Partners Healthcare, the parent of Brigham and Women's and Mass General Hospitals, the largest healthcare delivery organization in New England, and among the largest biomedical research and training enterprises in the United States. Previously, he had been president of Brigham and Women's Hospital and also served as president of North Shore Medical Center and as chair of Partners Psychiatry and Mental Health System. He served as a member of the board of directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston from 2012 to 2016, which incidentally is where my parents met, and as its chair from 2016 to 2018. And he was the chair of Boston Private Industry Council, the workforce board of the city of Boston. Prior to coming to Boston, he spent 15 years in positions of increasing leadership in healthcare in Philadelphia. He established the University of Pennsylvania Medical Center's first program in geriatric psychiatry and developed it into a nationally recognized research, training, and clinical program. And he served as executive vice chair of psychiatry and associate dean for managed care at the University of Pennsylvania Medical Center, and as director and CEO of Friends Hospital, the nation's first freestanding psychiatric hospital. And I'll turn lastly, but not least, to Jami Taylor, who is a recognized expert in innovative financing for pharmaceutical research, development, access, and delivery. Most recently, as an investor relations lead at Reata Pharmaceuticals, she helped to secure a $350 million investment from Blackstone Life Sciences to advance promising compounds within the company's pipeline. Previously, she was a managing director at Stanton Park Capital, providing advisory services to private companies in the life sciences. She spent more than 7 years in global leadership roles at Johnson & Johnson, and she was also a co-founder of the Johnson & Johnson Global Public Health Organization. And prior to that, she spent more than 10 years at the firm she founded as an undergraduate, which provides alliance development and communication services to an elite roster of clients, including major pharmaceutical and biotech companies. Her experience beyond the industry includes work with the White House Office of Public Liaison, members of the US Congress, and the US Departments of Treasury, Commerce, and Health and Human Services to advance legislative and policy priorities on a nationwide scale. In 2014, she was named a cross-sector leadership fellow at the Presidio Institute, a program created by the White House Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation to advance the work of leaders addressing society's most complex challenges. She is an alumna of Northwestern University, Harvard University, and the University of Virginia, and is a frequent presenter at major international forums and a lecturer at leading universities, including MIT's Sloan School of Management, the Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania, Harvard Law, and Harvard Business School. So that is a lot of bios, but it's all to say that we have really top experts and top minds who can come at this question from really many different perspectives. So with that, I'd like to kick it off, and I'm going to turn to Dr. Gottlieb first. And the question where I'd like to start is really to frame what the problem is. And with that, drugs don't exist in a vacuum. They are a complex system. They're part of a complex system of individuals, governments, companies, and healthcare systems. So if you could tackle any piece of this puzzle when it comes to access to medicine, what do you think should be prioritized? I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Courtney, and it's a privilege to serve on this panel with Thomas, Jami, and you. Solutions that bring 21st century vaccines and medicines to those at greatest need are necessary, but they're not sufficient. Vertical solutions that focus specifically on medicines without more generally investing in health system strengthening and in universal health coverage, at the end of the day become woefully inadequate, especially when facing the power of a pandemic that is most lethal in high-risk populations and people with pre-existing conditions. A major general pre-existing condition is severe poverty. Most of the poorest countries in the world are also medical deserts. For example, while there are about somewhere just under 30 physicians per 10,000 people in the United States, the UK, and Canada, there are about 0.2 physicians per 10,000 people in Somalia, in Sierra Leone, and in Malawi. At Partners in Health, we went into West Africa during the Ebola crisis, and an evaluation in about 2010 of public hospitals in Sierra Leone compared them unfavorably to US Civil War field hospitals in their capacity to do a variety of surgical procedures, medical stabilization, even aspects of maternity care. And additionally, there were very few in the way of labs. So in a pandemic where testing becomes a major issue and looking at a variety of other critical diagnostic outcomes, the need for very rapid point of service testing and investment in labs becomes critical as part of the overall infrastructure. These conditions at baseline, in the absence of a pandemic, really have unthinkable effects on a variety of what we expect to be ordinary public health outcomes. For example, maternal mortality rates in Sierra Leone and Liberia and Lesotho are about 1,000 per 100,000 live births. That's about a 1% maternal mortality rate each time a woman gives birth, and about a 5.5% lifetime risk of dying in childbirth. At the same time, in terms of pre-existing conditions, those that would expose people to infections, the point prevalence of HIV infection in Lesotho is about 23% in the adult population. The WHO estimates that about 14% of COVID-19 patients will require hospitalizations, and that's in places with many fewer hospital beds than we have here in the United States. About 5% are going to need a ventilator. And while some countries are doing their best to set up extra beds, first, the issue of staffing, having enough nursing personnel to be able to manage them, and then to be able to do complex stuff, taking care of very sick people and having the appropriate equipment is also a critical component of that. And critical care beds is probably an extremely important part of predicting outcome in the most vulnerable of those populations, as well as any older populations that there are. One of the reasons the United States mortality rate, while extremely high per capita in terms of expectation, remains lower is because of the advanced nature of critical care in the United States. And in fact, we have an illness care system here, not a healthcare system overall, which is a different problem to discuss. But here, we have about 35 critical care beds per 100,000 people. There are 19 countries in Africa that have less than one critical care bed per 100,000. So the notion that one's going to have that degree of nursing intensity, the equipment that's necessary, oxygen supply, and ventilators is pretty critical. And the ventilator capacity is even less. There are about 4 countries in Africa that have no ventilators at all. And while here, remember in New York, we were talking about ventilator capacity and what might be available. Hospitals had about 70 or 80,000. There were about 50 or 60,000 that were in available storage in a variety of places in emergency capacity. There were about 125,000 that were available. Now there's a pipeline to another 200,000. In Nigeria, with 200 million people, there are 500 ventilators. And to not have anesthesiologists, anesthetists, and others who can intubate people, as well as appropriate intensive care nurses and subspecialists, all of a sudden, the ability to care for people as they become sicker, regardless of the medicines that are available, starts to dissipate pretty remarkably. For example, remdesivir, which was the first drug that was approved that showed to have some effect on both reducing overall hospital length of stay and associated mortality, those studies were in the context of having intensive care unit beds, as well as a high degree of intensity in regard to nursing and oxygen and other kinds of capacity that don't exist within those infrastructures. Similarly, dexamethasone, which is the first drug that was demonstrated in clinical trials to be effective in reducing mortality for very, very sick people, largely those on ventilators, is dependent on either ventilator capacity or substantial oxygenation. So the notion of bringing medicines themselves without building infrastructure in that context becomes increasingly problematic. On the other hand, when we start to think about solutions like those that Thomas and Jami is going to start to describe to us, there are a variety that have created both markets as well as health system strengthening simultaneously. The Global Fund, which was started in 2002 to focus on HIV, malaria, and TB treatment, overall has saved probably about 32 million lives, not just in creating access to drugs, not just in creating markets that create feasible pricing for drugs as well, but as well as expending funds on training, on health system strengthening, on making sure that there are laboratories in a variety of different places that can support intervention for those other disorders, to be able to do rapid point of service testing, but also to follow populations that become increasingly complex, and that can train nursing personnel, community health workers, and create other infrastructure, in fact, as well as to build hospitals. Similarly, the massive bilateral investment that was made actually under President Bush through PEPFAR, that's treated more than 20-some-odd million people with antiretroviral therapy and HIV, is not a vertical solution. It's in fact been a vertical and horizontal set of investments that have created infrastructure for overall delivery. Once it was demonstrated that one could use a set of innovations like community health workers and others to be able to make sure that people had observed treatment, ongoing treatment on a daily basis, as well as testing and follow-up. And also to build supply chains, cold chain, and a variety of other components that are critical in order to be able to manage any of those kinds of investments. Gavi is probably another godsend that is critical to think about in this context. Really, I think brainchild of the Gates Foundation and Bill and Melinda Gates, together with a number of other donor countries. Gavi has, as an overall alliance since 2000, vaccinated half of the world's children, and has done so by creating purchasing collaboratives, as well as negotiating appropriate prices, but also creating delivery structure, supply chain, cold chain, and working with countries to do enough health system strengthening to make sure that there's accessibility. Again, if there are only vaccines and there isn't a sustainable healthcare system, that's problematic. But if one can put elements of those together, it's pretty critical. And by using some of the market power that exists overall, the vaccination of children with 11 of the WHO required vaccines costs about $28 through Gavi, as opposed to $1,100 in the United States. So the pricing itself becomes sensitive overall and creates those markets. And Now about 15 of the countries that have been involved in Gavi have started to create their own self-financing for national vaccination programs as they become further independent and create the infrastructure that's necessary to be able to participate in those markets. Similarly, UnitAid and the Clinton Health Action Initiative, CHI, have been very effective in trying to negotiate prices. CHI is very active right now in working with bringing Hep C treatments now that we have a cure to the developing world, but that's been a challenging piece. And those models have enabled NGOs to build kind of innovations. Partners in Health, it's kind of a combination of community health workers, health outposts, clinics, and then hospitals that are all on the government side together. But having those community health workers allowed PIH, Last Mile Health, and others in Liberia to be able to train people to do contact tracing and testing overall that enabled essentially the elimination of Ebola after killing several thousand people. Those same kinds of infrastructures will be necessary here to abet the process of both treatments and vaccines as they're available. On the other hand, these are there are potholes in these processes. We're still looking at 1.5 million deaths a year from tuberculosis. And over the course of the last 30 years, we just saw the first 3 new drugs available for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And UnitAid, Global Fund, and others have helped to fund the dissemination of those medicines, but to get the manufacturers to be interested in those has had to be able to develop markets and, frankly, a high degree of generosity on their part in order to participate, at least in the trials that have demonstrated the effect that starts to build the markets that are necessary. But having the infrastructure has proven effect as well. After the earthquake in Haiti, cholera was present for the very, very first time as a result of some errors that were made on the part of the UN. And Partners in Health, working together with that vaccine manufacturer, was able to create herd immunity with a 2-dose vaccine and have 93% of people within a specific region vaccinated who were the highest risk populations, but 93% and creating herd immunity within a several-month period of time with 2 vaccines, with 2 doses, which were critical to the outcome. So these are possible. The funding needs to be necessary, the will needs to be necessary, and the infrastructure needs to be there as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gottlieb. It's a wonderful introduction to a very complex problem, and it sounds very much like having a holistic approach really lays the foundation for success. I'd like to kind of take one of your points about TB and some of the treatments and apologies because this is not my lane, so I might get some of the vocabulary wrong. But some of the treatments and or vaccines, and use that as the jumping off point to turn to you, Dr. Pogge, to talk a little bit about vaccine access a little bit more specifically, because this is something that you've looked at and developed your own ideas for better ways to align access for individuals with profits for companies, because I think you've seen that as a hurdle to addressing some of these problems in these diseases. So with that, I'd like to turn to you, and if you could explain a little bit about what you see as a possible solution to vaccine and treatment development in general.
Yes, very happy to do that, Courtney, and thank you for bringing us together for this really fantastic discussion. And our work, this is really a team effort, I should say, that also includes economist Aidan Hollis and a bunch of younger people who are working with us. Our work is focused on one component in this very complicated network of problems that Gary so competently outlined. And that is, how do we incentivize innovations in the pharmaceuticals sector? So now we have a one-size-fits-all system, one way of incentivizing pharmaceutical innovations, and that works through patents. A successful innovation that gets marketing approval gets a patent, 20-year product patent, and under the protection of that patent, it can then charge very high prices without fearing competition. So in that early patent period, which lasts typically somewhere around 12 years or so, the pharmaceutical innovator sells the product at a very high price, in which countries often that can be 1,000 times the cost of production, and thereby makes enough money to pay for the investment in the innovation and also make a decent profit. Now, we want to establish a second track on which pharmaceutical innovators can be rewarded. On that second track, you get no markup at all. You basically, your product is sold at the cost of production and distribution, but you get something else. You get a reward for the health gains that your pharmaceutical achieves in the world. Every year, there is a pool of reward money, and that money gets divided according to the health gains achieved by registered products in the preceding year. So innovators have a choice. They can register their product. If they do, they forgo the markup, but they do get these health impact rewards that are proportional to how much health impact they achieve in the world. Now, there are three important differences between the conventional system of rewards and the new health impact fund system of rewards. And let me say what they are. The first one is that a lot of diseases that are now not lucrative targets for research would suddenly become very lucrative. Which diseases are those? Well, those are the diseases of the poor. Poor people cannot afford to pay high prices for medicines, and so very little is done about their diseases. Gary mentioned tuberculosis, for example, and said that 3 new drugs have just come on the market, and these were the first drugs in 40 years. There's very little research on tuberculosis, very little research on malaria. There are 20 neglected diseases listed by the WHO. Most of them are infectious diseases, which pharmaceutical companies largely ignore. So the Health Impact Fund would make these diseases prime targets of research. A lot of people suffer from these diseases. People die from them in large numbers. Again, Gary mentioned 1.5 million people die from TB. We have so far 600,000 COVID-19 deaths. So these are massive diseases. Huge health gains can be achieved by bringing to market a new pharmaceutical that really works, including, of course, vaccines very prominently. The second difference to the conventional system is poor people get access right from the beginning. They don't have to wait until the patent's expired and the medicine becomes available for generic production. Right away, the medicine is there, the vaccine, whatever it is there at the cost of production, which typically is actually very, very low. Medicines are surprisingly cheap to produce. Now, cheap medicines also have a problem. And the problem is that when a medicine is very cheap, no one has an incentive to bring it to people, to bring it to poor people in remote locations. If a medicine costs $1 a package, how much effort are you going to take to bring it to poor people? The Health Impact Fund solves that problem also, because the money that a pharmaceutical company makes on delivering its medicine to people is not limited by the sales price. Even if the sales price is only $1, you can make $50 on saving a person's life with that medicine by capturing the health impact reward that is given by the Health Impact Fund each year at the end of the year. So the old paradox that medicines, what's the optimal price, right? If they're too expensive, poor people can't afford them. If they are too cheap, nobody's gonna make any effort to bring it to poor people in remote locations. That paradox is solved by the Health Impact Fund by complementing the sales price by the health impact reward. There's a third thing, which is maybe the most important of all and really important in connection also with COVID-19. And that is fighting diseases at the population level. If you have a patent and you sell your medicine at a high price, you will not be interested in the disease disappearing. you don't want that disease to be eradicated. You're not going to say that out loud, but really, your profit depends on the continued existence of the disease. You're going to do your best to help individual patients, of course, because your medicine will be bought only if it's successful, but you will not spend a lot of time and effort trying to shrink the incidence of the disease. The Health Impact Fund provides exactly the opposite incentive. You hit the jackpot if you can eradicate the disease. You get paid for the difference that your drug makes to the damage that the disease produces in the world. If you eradicate the disease within 5, 6, 7 years, then the difference that your drug makes or made is enormous, namely all the difference between having a high level of incidence of the disease and having 0 incidence of the disease. This is why I call it the jackpot. You've just hit the jackpot. You get paid for the next 3 years. It's a 10-year reward period. You get paid full hog, the maximum amount, without having to actually do any work. And you can then use that money to invest into your next research project. So we're not trying to abolish the old system. We are simply saying, let's parallel to the old system. Let's have a second system of rewards funded through public monies from hopefully many governments, different governments contributing in proportion to their gross national product. Let's have that second system and thereby solve the kinds of gaps that the current system leaves. And these gaps really have to do with poverty. We are not doing enough for the disease of the poor. We are not, even the medicines that we do develop, we are not making them accessible to the poor. And we are thereby losing the opportunity to eradicate diseases, because if we ignore the poor, we are essentially keeping them around as breeding grounds on which the diseases can develop and new drug-resistant variants of the diseases can develop that in the end, of course, endanger us all. Again, we have learned that from COVID-19, I think, that it's a very bad idea to worry about diseases only when they hit our shores, only when they hit affluent people. We have to be proactive, fight diseases at the population level, and always think global.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pogge. That's a really, I think, excellent introduction to the idea of a health impact fund and some of the different, a parallel structure that has different profit incentives. I do have a lot of follow-up questions, but I'm trying to be mindful of time. And so for those listening, at any point, if you want to put a question in the Q&A box, you can. Right now, I want to turn to you, Jami, and just get your reaction to both what Dr. Gottlieb and Dr. Pogge used as a means of introduction. And if you could tell a little bit about how pharmaceutical companies are viewing this problem of access to medicine, as well as solutions such as a health impact fund.
Sure, I'd love to. I have to say that all of this discussion has really prompted a lot of personal reflection for me. I've been in the access to medicine space in the context of industry for more than 20 years. And so I've been inside many of these heated discussions around models and opportunities and programs and gaps. And I can tell you there's been a huge amount of hand-wringing over this entire stretch of time. And there's been a sense that ours is not a business model of our own making. And there are certain constraints with it that the industry is subject to that make systemic change or accommodation of systemic change very difficult for the industry itself to lead and to drive, which is why a conversation like this with both the esteemed panelists and of course the esteemed audience really engaging in this kind of dialogue is exactly what really can help move the needle at a time of great urgency. I think all of us feel that sense of urgency. And I know that the industry itself, for all of the breakthroughs that we've seen and experienced, continues to feel a sense of frustration that we can do more. And thinking back to this business model, Courtney, I'll key off of you and your discussion of how your parents met. Both of my parents worked on a key piece of legislation called the Hatch-Waxman Act, put in place in the early 1980s, which in essence created, and then over time in the US and over time on a worldwide basis, this sort of birth of the generics industry and an acceptance of an innovation arm versus an access arm when it comes to access to medicines. So interestingly, my father left government and became a major advocate for the generics industry and gave shape to the generics industry in many ways as the founder of the Generics Pharmaceutical Association and as the first global head of government affairs for Mylan, now the largest generic drug company in the world. I, on the other hand, was coming of age at a time when the Human Genome Project was underway. I was reading books about genetics and biotechnology, was absolutely enthralled with that new and burgeoning field. And my dinner table conversations would be this kind of innovation versus access dichotomy, which I realized, especially after meeting Professor Pogge, which I realized was an artificial dichotomy exacerbated by a model driven by Hatch-Waxman and some of the later moves on the part of the industry and on the part of the entire community as we began to separate innovation from access in very definitive and problematic ways. But ultimately, innovation and access live under one roof. They are blood relatives. They are intimately connected and cannot be separated. But unfortunately, the incentive system as it exists has created this very out of balance system and a business model that drives innovation at the expense of access, or access only after what I call the scourge of waiting, where patients in need are in a position of waiting for years and receive the opportunity for access only upon the point of patent expiry in many cases, and even then are fully dependent on the willingness of a generics industry to pick up that particular asset and produce it and distribute it. So there are many complexities here. Gary touched on many of them, but if you take anything away from this discussion, or at least my portion of it, know that this separation of innovation and access and how that separation has shaped the business model in the pharma industry as we know it has become increasingly problematic over time. And although there is light ahead, and as I describe some of the hurdles that I think the industry is facing right now, I'll continue to provide some of these personal reflections, but also suggest that there is light at the tunnel and there are ways that we are achieving breakthroughs. And we see it right now in very definitive ways with respect to COVID-19 and how R&D is taking place through multiple consortia, certainly an interest in scale and distribution like never before. This will be a very challenging future ahead, but one that has the potential to absolutely reshape the structure of the industry fundamentally and the models within which it works. And most importantly, it gives rise to the opportunity finally for the implementation of the Health Impact Fund, for example, a model that can sit in complement to the historical IP model as we've described it, but correct for some of its ills and provide a voluntary opportunity for pharma to really shift over and participate in global health innovation and access, potentially like never before. So thinking about the hurdles that tie to this business model challenge, and again, this bifurcation of innovation and access and how it's affected it, we see that expressed very heavily in the investment model for the industry. There's nothing like sitting inside an investment committee meeting where R&D decisions and investment decisions around the advancement of certain molecules, where those discussions take place. I can tell you they're very heated discussions, and they're situated around the economic concept of opportunity cost, which is challenging in its own right. Many times when you're sitting in those settings, you're choosing between putting $1 into Alzheimer's research versus $1 into neglected disease research. And I remember the first time I think I spoke with Dr. Pogge, I called and told him, I cannot make the business case in the investment committee setting, in this case for antimicrobials. This was well ahead of and well prior to much of the good work that's been done to shore up the business case for AMR. But the investment model and the way it operates in pharma companies keeps at bay and keeps on the shelf many promising assets. Thankfully, there have been new repositories for those assets in the form of the DNDI, the TB Alliance, other sort of nonprofit repositories. But none have that kind of full R&D power that the pharma industry does. And so it's important to recognize that that opportunity cost tension is very challenging. And what compounds that is what I'll describe as a historically unforgiving shareholder community. We've often wrestled with the fact that where we, meaning the industry, and in this case, I'll situate my commentary specifically around a company where I work, Johnson & Johnson, we watched the markets very, very closely when we made major announcements with respect to global public health, the establishment, for example, of our global public health organization, and in particular, our decision to unlock $500 million in support of Ebola vaccine research. At the point at which we made that announcement, the market punished us. And that in of itself was a very powerful blow, and thankfully not a fatal blow, but a very powerful blow to the work that we were doing internally, indicative of the great will that our leadership had and there at J&J continues to have. But the composition of your shareholders is incredibly important, and in an absolutely profit-driven, and I would argue hedge fund heavy environment around small biotech in particular, this becomes especially difficult and problematic. You live, especially for small cap, mid cap biotechs, you live and you die by the character and the composition of your shareholder base. Interestingly, if you read some of the small biotechs who have pursued research in COVID-19, if you read their press releases, it's almost like a special assurance to an unforgiving shareholder base, where they promise in the CEO quotes, they make promises that this area of research, this direction of research will not distract them from their lead programs or their core programs. They're very apologetic in tone. I would encourage anyone curious to go and read those press releases. So rather than celebrating the direction or celebrating the commitment to public health, we have this almost apologetic, please don't hurt us tone in many of those press releases, which is again indicative of an unforgiving shareholder environment. I am hugely faithful in the ESG movement. I've seen how the ESG movement is shaping this space very dramatically and has the potential to drive forward change at the level that's required within companies at the investment committee level, and then more structurally in terms of endorsing directions and new models like the Health Impact Fund. I encourage anyone working in or having any proximity to ESG investing, of course, environmental, social, governance driven investing, anyone working through that lens or in that community to amplify their efforts to really validate and provide positive reinforcement to companies that are working toward that population health aim and working to really close the gaps that have been described so eloquently by Gary and by Thomas. I'll add also, and this is, I think, something that's particularly interesting, Courtney, to this audience, and that's political intention and will. What's really kept many of these structural opportunities at bay is the fact that within the industry and beyond, the larger public health community that's working in the policy space has been trying to force fit or slice or narrow down very promising models to be able to fit kind of a flavor of the day or an interest or any small window of opportunity. I remember, for example, sitting in a neglected disease hearing. We'd waited 10 years for a neglected disease hearing of this type, and sitting with Peter Hotez there, who's a force in his own right in COVID-19 vaccine research and otherwise, and sitting with my own leadership. We looked behind us and there was almost no one in the room, and in front of us where we'd expect end-to-end congressmen to be sitting, decision makers to be there and paying attention, almost no member of Congress appeared at the hearing. Rather, we had the erstwhile staffer there to keep a seat warm and to check a formality box. The political attention and will piece has been severely lacking, and even where we've seen a glimmer of interest, it's been very, very limited, and that's been the case in AMR, at least in certain geographical settings and certain political settings, with some exceptions, especially the UK. And so that's created its own sort of dysfunction as the industry has attempted to be innovative on the policy shaping side. I can remember a phone call when I was working on a neglected tropical diseases policy task force, where I was told, cancel everything with NTD, simply copy paste AMR in and transpose everything over and put a new banner on top that says AMR. NTDs simply won't get the attention that they need. And it's not that NTDs had gone away, it's that we were attempting to satisfy a political moment, really without the panoptic lens that is required. And so those pieces, the investment model, the business model as it's been shaped in the ways that I've described, a shareholder base, absent the ESG segment that tends to be very unforgiving with respect to public health efforts, and then the political attention and will and those policy levers we need to be pulled, not just halfway or not just in a tokenistic way, but fully and in earnest to drive structural change. Those are all major hurdles, that I can thankfully say many within the industry recognize and hope in the near future to be able to overcome.
Thank you very much, Jami. Yes, so it sounds almost like there's, in some respects, regulation almost started this divided path between access and R&D, and yet at the same time, it sounds like we almost need some sort of, we need governmental will, because the industry wants some different stakeholders to come together to solve this, because it's not something that they could necessarily do on their own. So. So with that, I'd like to turn to the Q&A. Thank you all. I have a lot of questions myself, but I want to be fair to our participants. And again, if you have a question at any point, please do put it in the Q&A box. So the first one, I think this would be directed to you, Dr. Pogge, and it's regarding the funding of the Health Impact Fund. How would we determine which countries pay into the fund and how much, and will poor countries be able to access medicines developed through the fund even if they don't pay into the system? And I'd like to add my own question onto there, which is, how can you think through what some of the inequities that might arise in such a system, and how can you troubleshoot for that as well?
Yeah, so the way we envisage it is that we fund it through the collaboration of willing governments. We can't force governments to participate, of course, but governments that want to participate make a long-term commitment to put into the fund a proportion of their gross national incomes. We are thinking of something like 0.02%. That's a very, very small sliver. If we got about a third of the countries of the world to participate in that, we would get about $6 billion this way, $6 billion every year. And that would be enough to sustain somewhere in the order of 20 medicines. So 2 medicines would come on every year, 2 medicines would drop off every year. 20 medicines would always be there, fully funded, and would be available at the cost of production. Now, with regard to equity, countries that do not participate, if there are poor countries below the cutoff, maybe of the World Bank for lower middle income countries, they would participate. They would still get the benefit of the cheap drugs. But any affluent country that doesn't want to be part of the Health Impact Fund, that does not want to contribute, any such country would be excluded from the benefit. And that means that innovators would retain the right to charge high patent protected prices in that country. So if Japan, for example, decided we don't want to have anything to do with the Health Impact Fund, that's perfectly fine. The innovator then keeps the right to sell medicines at high prices, or that particular Health Impact Fund registered medicine at high prices in Japan. That has 2 nice effects. One effect, of course, is that Japan has an incentive to join. Its people will say, why is the drug cheap in the United States and not here? Answer, because your government decided not to join. And secondly, we also can make the fund more attractive for innovators, because innovators, when registering, can still retain certain affluent country markets, which are not part of the funding coalition. So we have a plan for the transition, basically. We start with a few willing countries, and then we build up as more countries join and maybe increase the size of the annual pools, and thereby also increase the number of new medicines that will choose to go the health impact fund route.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's some good detail added onto there. I'm going to turn to, we have someone, oh, okay. We had someone raising their hand, but now they're no longer raising their hand. I'm going to turn to Dr. Gottlieb with the next question, which is, could you please elaborate on how the Health Impact Fund would address the last mile problem, where even if affordable drugs existed, lesser developed countries might lack the infrastructure needed to act?
Yeah, let me just repeat the question because I couldn't hear it completely from you.
Oh, sure.
Why don't you repeat the last part?
It's a question about the last mile. So
Right.
even if the drugs are affordable, do lesser developed countries have the infrastructure needed to distribute them? And that's, whether it's the healthcare system itself to make them accessible, or even, I studied energy policy way back when, and
Sure.
I remember saying, if you can't refrigerate vaccines, then what's the point? So,
Right.
what's the larger infrastructure that's needed?
So while, I would have to ask Dr. Pogge and others who are focused on the fund would not be relevant unless it were able to participate in supply chain, in cold chain, and anticipation of overall distribution. And the cost of distribution has to somehow be calculated as part of the $6 billion annualized contribution and any other investment returns that fund would have in its pool over a period of time. Otherwise, that distribution becomes irrelevant. Obviously, one has to create partnerships with the countries who are recipients of those funds, both those who are contributors or contributors at a lower level, or those who can't afford to participate, because there are lower middle income countries that are sitting with deficits that are pretty substantial around distribution in various subregions that might not be able to participate quite as well or don't have as much infrastructure. But I think with each innovation, there has to be anticipated that this goes beyond discovery, goes beyond the proof of concept of the drug in its clinical trials, and the distribution needs to be somewhat de-risked. I mean, part of the excitement that Jami was describing of the collaboration that's existed right now with the federal government's participation in Warp Speed is that there's an anticipation of the need for rapid distribution that's being de-risked for those companies. This would have to be de-risked for the fund so that essentially there isn't penalty for those innovators who are participating in what might be greater difficulties in distribution or implementation at the local level. That doesn't create health system strengthening, but there probably should be funds set aside for anticipating that and how it fits into the variability that exists among health systems. And if that means, basically helping to hire community health workers, helping health outposts, as well as being able to establish protection of the supply chain, the cold chain, that would be necessary, and also might include investment in laboratory and point of service testing where it's available so that it becomes disseminated as part of those prices as well. I mean, you guys can speak to the accuracy of that, but without that, some of these issues become irrelevant because the drugs don't become, or vaccines don't become valuable.
Is that something, Dr. Pogge, you can comment on in terms of the de-risking for the distribution?
Yeah, sure. The basic idea is that we will provide money for delivering drugs and achieving health gains in poor countries, and thereby give pharmaceutical companies an incentive to help overcome whatever problems might stand in the way. Right? A pharmaceutical company is paid under the Health Impact Fund system in proportion to the health gains that it achieves. And so any obstacle, anything that stands between my product and health gains is something that I have an incentive to remove. And of course, here I will collaborate with many others. I will collaborate first and foremost with local health systems, try to support them with my know-how, maybe with money, to solve the problems that diminish the health impact that my product achieves. For example, the cold chain, I will help build the cold chain. I will maybe band together with a few other pharmaceutical companies that have different products also on the Health Impact Fund and also suffer from a lacking cold chain. Another very important partner would be the ones that Gary mentioned at the beginning, namely the Global Fund, Gavi, and so on. They also, that's their whole raison d'etre, is to bring medicines to developing countries, to poor people in remote areas. And they would collaborate with us. We deliver the product very, very cheaply. And they would then help with programs in these countries to bring these products to the end user in a way that also provides support for competent diagnostics, for people adhering to the treatment protocol, and so on. So pharmaceutical companies will be our allies. I mean, Jami described this really nicely, you know, how shareholders are constantly looking over the shoulders of the company and saying, you know, are you guys wasting our money here? And the Health Impact Fund turns that around, and the shareholders will say, are you making enough money on delivering important products to poor people? Are you creating enough health impact for the poor? Wouldn't it be nice to have, you know, profit-oriented shareholders focused on that question? How can we achieve more health impact in poor remote areas?
Thomas, it would seem, though, that there would have to be some availability in the fund depending upon the size of the developer. With small and mid-sized biopharmaceutical companies, their ability to then create some of those same kind of infrastructure investments that a giant like J&J could would be more limited. And therefore, the fund would have to provide for that, because awaiting the bonus while burning so much cash in something that's just been developed would be more challenging. And given that, you know, so much of discovery is now happening in small small and mid-sized companies because of some of the failures of larger companies in the traditional small molecule model. The fund itself should have to anticipate that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I would say that those smaller firms will collaborate. They will work together because national health systems and NGOs and international agencies also have an interest in tackling these diseases. And insofar as small players are not able, you know, they can't single-handedly build an infrastructure, and they shouldn't. We shouldn't want them to run loose in poor countries and sort of say, okay, now we take over. We want them to collaborate with national health systems, with local NGOs and so on, in order to solve those problems. And I think once there is an incentive, then these companies will find a good way to solve the last mile problems, or at the very least, they will, as they think about which research projects to undertake, anticipate, will we be able, if we do this research and come up with a good product, will we then be able to solve the last mile problems or not? If not, maybe we stay away from this project and do something else.
And I'll just add that that's really the breakthrough of the Health Impact Fund, is that it creates and sits at the nexus of innovation and access with respect to an incentive structure. You've got incentives heavily laden on the innovation side for small biotechs and so forth, and I would argue large pharma as well, which is woefully deficient, most of them, with respect to access infrastructure, especially in emerging and frontier markets. So you've got that camp, and then you've got a whole access body of players on this side, the Global Fund, Gavi, et cetera, where access is entirely their raison d'etre, as Dr. Pogge suggested, but very little connects the two, at least from an incentive standpoint, and where the Health Impact Fund can play that role in structuring those incentives, it will constitute a breakthrough and a welcome one from an industry point of view.
Thank you. Thank you all for that. Oh, sorry, did you have something you wanted to add, Dr. Pogge? Oh, no, okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn really quickly now to a question from Karina Cullen, who wants to ask you, Jami, about how the unforgiving shareholder community can be squared with the recent roundtable statement with many big pharma members that corporations should not serve just shareholders, but all stakeholders. So it sounds like, you know, perhaps is the industry moving into a widening scope of where their responsibility lies. And how do you square those pieces?
Right. So I love this question, in part because I was part of some of the early work that led to the announcement of the Business Roundtable. Johnson & Johnson, many of you know, was a major voice and leader and shaper of that particular movement. In many ways, it's a repudiation of the sentiment of the historical sentiment of the shareholder community. It's also a full embrace of the ESG community, and I think a hopeful move through that embrace to really augment ESG. And I think we've seen that. In fact, we've seen it grow almost exponentially since the Business Roundtable announcement. There are many gaps yet to be filled. There are many structural pieces at play. Bottom line profit in a traditional sense, not just the triple bottom line. It still reigns heavy, and it reigns heavily over especially very capital constrained, extremely capital markets dependent younger firms that are carrying forward much of the most exciting discovery and development in the space. So we've got more work to do, and we've got more structures to build. And here again, the Health Impact Fund provides, in my mind, a needed repository and source of relief with respect to that more hard-nosed traditional shareholder base. And it provides that voluntary choice that can sit complementary to what we've seen and experienced historically, which does have its merits, but also provides a pathway to the future, and a future that I think we're all hoping for, particularly at this moment.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. I think we probably have about time for one more question. I'm going to turn to one from Sandeep Gulati, and I'm going to change it a little bit, but Sandeep is asking about in the context of a COVID vaccine, which is one, supply limited, and two, has a long line of rich countries waiting and willing to pay much more, much higher prices for that. So just taking us a step back and looking at this idea of a health impact fund within the context, or not just health impact fund, but access to vaccines within the context of COVID. What do you think could be done now, given what might be a longer timeline to align for something like a health impact fund versus the immediate need to develop and distribute a COVID-19 vaccine? And I suppose I might turn to you first, Dr. Pogge, with that one, if you're willing.
Yeah, so of course, I think the fundamental principle here should be that we should use scarce resources in a way that fights the disease most cost effectively at the population level. So we should focus, for example, on healthcare workers. We should focus on those patients where we pay attention to them, that will reduce the incidence of the disease, sort of use our limited resources strategically. And of course, at the same time, we should try to maximize the resources that we have. And here, intellectual property rights and patents and the attempt to get as much of a markup as possible should not stand in the way of using whatever manufacturing capacity we have to multiply supply, right? And so to some extent that is happening now. We are massively producing, even in advance of knowing which vaccine will ultimately pan out and work. We are massively producing, but we could do a good bit better than that already. And again, the key is that we not ration access according to who has the greatest ability to pay, but rather try to bring the vaccine exactly to those people who's receiving it will have the greatest impact on the course of the pandemic. We want to get that pandemic shrunk. We want to reduce the rate of incidence as fast as possible and to prevent a lot more people from becoming sick with COVID-19.
I realize we're about to bump up against time, but I just want to press a little bit more on that, and picking up on a point that Dr. Gottlieb made earlier, which is that I think it's something like in countries like the US and Canada, we have, I forget what it is, it's something like 30 physicians per, yes, and it's much less in other countries. Is there a mechanism to say, okay, well, if we're distributing this to, say, healthcare workers first, are we making sure that the healthcare worker in Liberia also gets that if there's just, one doctor per how we had 10,000 people. And I apologize if I'm getting this statistic wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Dr. Pogge makes the point that we need to make sure the infrastructure is strong. So whoever is providing it is closest level to those who are ill, who are at risk, need to be in the absolute first tier of those people who are vaccinated. That could mean community health workers, health access workers, public health nurses, and those who are in the basic infrastructure. And additionally, who are the vulnerable populations, because that's where the costs of disease are. And the impoverished population, we've demonstrated, is at far highest risk. I mean, older adults in nursing homes and extremely poor people and people with coexisting diseases, which would make, very frankly, the poorest 2 billion people in the world the first to get a substantial proportion of vaccine. And make no mistake, this infection gets on a plane. This infection gets in a boat. This infection will permeate the whatever kinds of firewalls have been created. We demonstrated that with Ebola. Obviously, we demonstrated that here between Asia and then Europe and the United States. So the notion of, the focus on having 300 and some odd million doses or 600 million for 2 doses for the United States is irrelevant. We need at least 5 billion doses in order to be able to get the kind of global herd immunity. And that should be the objective of what all of this funding is. And relief from this has to have a timetable that's around 5 to 6 billion doses that need to be administered as rapidly as possible. Obviously, 7 billion being the most important, but that has to think through each of our funding. We have to exploit Gavi as a mechanism because it's helped us to be able to build an infrastructure, and the Global Fund, and frankly, PEPFAR and each of the other bilateral, multilaterals that exist already, and the great infrastructure that the pharmaceutical industry has created in thinking through a variety of other distribution models, because frankly, their business model fails if we have a persistent pandemic throughout the world that essentially destroys their markets. And so I think the hierarchy that Dr. Pogge described is pretty compelling.
And I'll just add, this is a great challenge of our time, and anyone interested in the challenge of public health or political will or international relations or any aspect of what we've talked about today, everyone here has a responsibility to step up and participate and support the access effort. I think we'll find that it's much more difficult than the R&D effort, and it will take all of us to really make it a success, especially amid some of the early stage havoc we've seen with respect to it.
That seems like a good place to conclude. Thank you all for the work that you're doing on a problem that I think, as Jami illustrated, is one that doesn't get much attention, but really, really should. And you're all addressing your own ways, important components of this piece. So thank you for that work. With that, I think we'll conclude. I wish you all a good day, and for those on the East Coast, I hope the storm isn't that bad. And for those who are listening who want to join our next event before we take a little bit of a late summer break is next week, and we have the legendary spy master Jack Devine, who will be in conversation talking about challenges to the intelligence community. And that is next, I forget the day of the week, it's the August 11th, and that will be at 11 a.m. So I hope you all can join us. And thank you all for the work that you do. And we'll post this on our YouTube channel as well. So so for those who didn't get to catch the whole thing, or you want to share it around, I hope that you do.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.